Well, brethren, we read of the life of Jesus Christ that the period of time of his adolescence and young manhood is basically summed up in one single verse. We, in the books of Matthew and Luke, are given a little bit of insight into the events right around his birth and as a little infant on up until the time when his family fled to Egypt and then got back, came back, fled from Bethlehem down to Egypt and then came back up to Nazareth. A little bit of events concerning the first few months of his life. And then we're given a very brief vignette of events right around the time he was 12 years of age. He and his family describes an occasion when he was 12 of him coming up to Jerusalem for the Passover with his family. And at the point where he left with his family to go back to Nazareth, the rest of his life up until he turned 30 and appeared there with John the Baptist to be pointed out as the Messiah and to be baptized. That period of what we would term his teenage years, his 20s, is basically summed up in one verse there in the book of Luke. We're simply told that Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Now, increasing in stature is no particular problem. If you live, most likely, if you're 12 years old and you live, well, you're going to increase in stature. That comes pretty naturally. You're going to grow. You're going to get taller. And sometimes as we get older, we quit growing in stature and start growing in girth, but that's another subject. But coming on up through your teenage years, to grow in stature is natural. You get bigger, you grow, you come on up toward adulthood. Growing in stature comes naturally. Growing in wisdom isn't necessarily so. Growing in wisdom and in favor with God and man. Well, to grow in favor with God means obviously that he deepened his spiritual relationship, that Jesus Christ matured and developed spiritually, and that pre-incarnate memory began increasingly to come back, probably from right around that age on, because clearly he had exceptional insight at the age of 12. And by the time he was an adult, and at the beginning, early in his ministry, he made references to the fact that in one case, he said, I saw Satan fall as lightning from heaven. On another occasion, he was talking about Abraham and how Abraham desired to see my day. And the Pharisees made some smart comment, said, well, you're not even 50 years old. How do you know anything about Abraham? And he said, before Abraham was, I am. So clearly, by the time that Jesus Christ had entered his ministry, the incarnate memory, the memory of having been in the beginning with the Father was clearly there. It was something that he understood. And he remembered these events of centuries past, millennia past, aeons past, and was able, therefore, to reveal the Father in a unique way. Now, he was born as a little tiny human baby, and he had to grow and to mature and to develop. And as his mind developed, those memories gradually began to come back, and I would take it from the account in Luke that around the age of 12 he began to more and more clearly understand and to began to return to him certain of those that memory and that insight that had been there. We're told that as he continued to grow up and to develop, he grew in wisdom and in favor with God and man. He developed in terms of his to grow in favor with man. He grew and matured, developed socially, developed in his ability to relate with other people, to get along with people. He grew and developed in that area. in all of the, let's say, the social skills, the things that are needed to interact with people. He grew and developed spiritually and grew in favor with God, came to deepen his relationship with the Father and to build that in a more and more intense way. He also grew in wisdom. Now, what does it mean to grow in wisdom, and what kind of wisdom are we talking about? There are a lot of things that pass for wisdom. Some people have a lot of education. This theologian I was reading about earlier, this Harvard theologian. Well, if you're a theologian at Harvard University, you're bound to be a pretty smart fellow. You're bound to have a bunch of degrees. You've been, in school and you got this degree and that degree. And of course, some of these folks with a lot of degrees are sort of like what my grandmother used to call smart fools, because they may have a lot of knowledge and they've read this book and that book. And they've, read what Dr. So-and-so said, but they really don't have the ability to put it all together and to make sense of it in terms of real life. Now, wisdom is not something that we just naturally grow into. There's a certain amount of maybe practical skills and practical assessment of life that most people gain as the years go by and they accrue experience. Everybody doesn't even gain that, but most people do gain at least a certain amount of insight and perception that comes with life. But often, by the time they've come to know what they need to know, all they can do is sort of look back with hindsight and wish they had known it 20 years before or 40 years before or whatever it is. The Bible has a lot to say about growing in wisdom, and it also has a lot to say about the opposite of that. The opposite of growing in wisdom is being foolish. Now, let's start out and let's look at how the Bible defines a fool. We'll notice three different aspects of the definition. First off, let's notice in Psalm 14. Psalm 14, verse 1. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They're corruptible, or they're corrupt, they've done abominable works, there's none that does good. The Lord looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand and seek God. They're all gone aside, they're all together become filthy, there's none that does good, no, not one. Have all the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread and call not upon the eternal. Coming on down to verse 7, all that the salvation of Israel will come out of Zion. When the Lord brings back the captivity of his people, Jacob shall rejoice and Israel shall be glad. Now he talks about the fact that the fool has said in his heart there is no God. So starting point of a definition for somebody who's very foolish is God is not real to the fool. The fool has said in his heart there is no God. Anybody that can look at the universe in which we live, can look at the world, can look at all the things around us, and conclude that there is no God, is pretty foolish indeed. Paul talks about that in Romans chapter 1. He says they're without excuse. There's no justification for being an atheist, because all you have to do is just look around you a little bit. Paul talks about that matter in Romans 1 and how that there is the evidence of God and in the creation and things that may be known of God. But the fool has said in his heart there is no God, and therefore he lives his life accordingly. Now let's look at one other definition of a fool found back in Proverbs chapter 14. Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 9, it says, fools make a mock at sin, but among the righteous there is favor. Fools make a mock at sin. In other words, they take sin as a joke. Sin's no big thing. Now, these are the concepts that really permeate our Western society. Our Western society has a religion. You know, we're a religious people, and basically the religion is secular humanism. Secular as opposed to sacred, humanism, man-centered as opposed to God-centered. And that's the approach of our Western society, a very secular view, dismissing the idea of a real God who intervenes in the affairs of men. And that leads to making a mock at sin, making a joke of sin. You know, Proverbs tells us that in Proverbs chapter 13, verse 20, it tells us that he that walks with wise men shall be wise, but a companion of fools will be destroyed. In other words, we are all influenced by those that we keep company with. Now, you just look, for example, at television. You know, that's you realize that the average American spends more time in front of a television set than any other activity except sleep. The adults average about 44 hours a week. Children about 24. Children under 5 average about 24 hours a week in front of a television set. These figures are old, probably more. But what do what kind of companionship? Well, if you look at most of the sitcoms, current sitcoms on television, they generally centered around some sort of immorality, adultery, fornication, homosexuality. They make a mock at sin. Sin's a joke. You know, sin is funny. You know, Three's Company, ha ha. And it is an attitude that permeates our society. We see it in movies, we see it in television, we see it in novels, we see it permeating popular society, making a mock at sin. Just viewing sin as a joke. And that is something that is not a joke. You know, we're coming up down in South Louisiana in particular. In a few days is a big, quite a big festivity. In fact, I guess it's coming up this coming Tuesday, called Mardi Gras, which is French for Fat Tuesday. You know, Fat Tuesday is the day before Ash Wednesday. That begins the 40 days of Lent, 40 days supposedly of penance that Catholics are supposed to go through prior to Easter. They're supposed to be good for about 6 weeks, but the theory is if you're going to have to be good for a few weeks, then you really need to tie one on and sort of go out with a bang before you have to be on good behavior. And that's what Mardi Gras is all about. You know, if you're down in South Louisiana, you can forget trying to do business from about yesterday noon on until Wednesday, because everything begins to shut down. Nothing's going on because they're all getting prepped up. They're getting tanked up for Mardi Gras. You know, and it is an excuse for that. The idea, you see, is that sin is all the stuff that's fun. God doesn't like folks to have fun. God doesn't have much sense of humor, doesn't like anything that's good. So it's fun, it's enjoyable. So you're really going to have to be on good behavior. So let's really blow one out. If we're going to have to do penance, well, let's. So, you know, sure enough, Ash Wednesday comes and their mouth probably tastes like ashes, and they probably look like ashes, and they go to the priest and get a little ash smeared on their forehead, and they're in business. You know, they're ready to do penance for 40 days. Well, it's a pagan concept of sin. You see, the Bible shows us that sin is the very opposite. Sin involves the things that are hurtful and harmful. Now, fools make a mock at sin. Sin's a joke. It's taken lightly. There's no. It is an absolutely backward approach as far as the Bible is concerned. Let's notice one other definition back in Proverbs 12. Proverbs 12 and verse 15. We're told the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkens unto counsel is wise. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes. See, the other characteristic, Fool says in his heart, there is no God. He makes a mock at sin, takes sin as a joke, and all of his ways are right in his own eyes. He is right and the world is wrong. He's a know-it-all. Can't tell him anything. You know, in Proverbs 9 it talks about that if you reprove a scorner, he's going to get mad at you. You got shame. If you rebuke a wise man, then he'll love you. It says, don't reprove a scorner, he'll hate you. Give instruction to a wise man and he'll be wiser. Total opposite approach to correction, to learning. The fool is, all the ways of a fool are right in his own eyes. And if you try to point something out to him, well, he's not going to like that. It tells us in Proverbs 28:26, same principle. It says, he that trusts in his own heart is a fool. Whoso walks wisely, he'll be delivered. If you trust in your own heart. Now, that is a key thing. People want to put their trust in their feelings and their impulses and what they feel. Well, the Scripture tells us that in reality it's the very opposite. The real answer is given back here in Proverbs chapter 3, where we're told to trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not to your own understanding. See, that's the opposite of the fool's approach, who trusts in himself. Trusts in his feelings, his impulses. He trusts in his own heart. So 3 specific characteristics of a fool that God singles out have to do with saying there is no God, making a joke out of sin, and trusting himself, having his confidence in himself, in his own feelings, and his own impulses. As God looks down at the world, and He looks at human beings made in His own image, and you look at all of the mess that's going on, and all of the pain, and all the suffering, and all of the problems, it's very obvious man has a great deal of intelligence. There are incredible things that people have been able to come up with in terms of inventions, in terms of technology. The problem that we suffer from is not a lack of intelligence and a lack of technology. It is a lack of the wisdom to make proper choices and decisions in life, and the character to carry those decisions out. See, Solomon had wisdom of knowing what ought to be done. He just lacked since he had the opportunity to do anything he wanted to, he lacked the character to say no to himself. And so even though Solomon talks about in the book of Proverbs, in the book of Ecclesiastes, he talks about certain things. He talks about in Proverbs, rejoice, with the wife of your youth. And he talks about how even in the book of Proverbs, one of the things he says he wrote it for was to stress the importance of wisdom, which will keep you from the strange woman. And talks about all the problems. Well, you go back and read the story of Solomon, you realize that he may have had the wisdom to have known what to do. He just lacked the character to enforce it upon himself. Well, God is interested in our developing wisdom and character, in developing the wisdom to know what to do and the character to carry it out. Now, as we look at the society, we see that there is no lack of intelligence and ability and technology, but there is a tremendous lack of wisdom. When you look at suffering that's going on, in sub-Saharan Africa, AIDS has become such an epidemic that it's threatening to wipe out whole segments of the society. And it's just incredible what is happening in some of those countries. Well, the answer, of course, is in God's Word all along in terms of what's the solution to the problem. There are reasons why those things happen. Our approach here in this country is to devote a lot of money to try and see if we can come up with a cure. That way we think that we can do whatever we want to do and somehow not pay the penalty. Well, we're going to find that that's not going to work. Now let's notice back in the New Testament, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Because wisdom can mean different things to different people. The ancient Greek society was a society that prided itself on education, on wisdom, on logic, on ability to analyze. They loved nothing better than to debate and argue, and they were always coming up with different philosophical approaches. Paul is here writing in 1 Corinthians to the church in Corinth. Corinth is a major city in Greece. It was certainly imbued with this Greek philosophy and this Greek approach. And so Paul talks a little bit about wisdom here. Because notice what he says, 1 Corinthians 1. And we'll pick it up in verse 17. He says, Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of none effect. For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness. But unto us which are saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I'll destroy the wisdom of the wise, I'll bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this world? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For after that, in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. For the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness. But unto them which are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. You see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to confound that which is mighty. Base things, and the things which are despised, is God chosen, yes, and the things which are not, to bring to naught the things that are, that no flesh should glory in His presence. Of Him are you in Christ Jesus, who of God is made unto us wisdom and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, that according as it is written, He that glories, let him glory in the Lord. Now, let's look right here. Let's look at this a little bit. Paul said, I didn't come with a lot of clever arguments and utilizing the kind of logic and the kinds of arguments that the Greeks are impressed with. I talked about the fact that Jesus Christ took our place. He died in our stead. That salvation is made possible through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, who paid the penalty for sin in our behalf. That God became flesh and dwelt among us. And He died and was raised by the power of God. Well, that struck the Greeks as very foolish. The idea that God became man and died in our stead. That was foolish to them. He said that the Jews require a sign. The Jews didn't like it. It was, as he said, that to those who are perishing, what Paul was preaching about was foolishness. But to those who are saved, or who are being saved, which is really the sense of the verb here, it is the power of God. So there's a contrast in the way people perceive things. You know, what the world may consider wise, God says is pretty foolish. And the wisdom of God is considered foolishness by the world. The Jews require a sign. The Greeks are seeking after wisdom. They're looking for some clever argument. But what we preach is a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks. But to those that are saved, whether Jew or Greek, it's the power of God and the wisdom of God. You see, God has chosen the foolish things to confound the wise. The foolishness of this world, or the wisdom of this of God, is foolishness to the world. And of course, the wisdom of this world is foolishness to God. That's what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 3. Let's notice here, 1 Corinthians 3:16. Know you not that you are the temple of God, and the Spirit of God dwells in you? That's why we are God's temple, God's habitation. The Spirit of God dwells in you. If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy. For the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. We're to recognize that when we defile our bodies, when we engage in immorality and things that are inappropriate, that defile the body, we're not just simply tampering with what is our own. We are defiling the temple of God. Let no man deceive himself, verse 18. If any man among you seems to be wise in this world, let him become a fool that he may be wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. The wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. So, verse 21, therefore let no man glory in men. That's not the thing to be proud of. You know, if you were to go to someone who was maybe a very astute financial planner, and you had financial problems, and he was to begin to try to work with your finances and give you advice on what you needed to do and what investments you needed to make and how you needed to manage your finances, you think the first place you'd turn would be back to Malachi 3 and say, well, now, are you robbing God? You know, are you tithing? Oh, no, that would seem foolish to him. Oh, you can't afford to give 10% to your church. Oh, no, you need to use that over here. Oh, you can't afford to go to that that church convention. You can't afford to keep that feast. Oh, no, you need to do this. You need to do that. Now, God says in Malachi, the wisdom of God is that if you don't tithe, you're robbing from God, and therefore you're cursed with a curse. That's the wisdom of God. Now, to the natural mind, that's foolishness. Why, if you give some away, you're going to have less than what you started with. You'll never get ahead that way. Turn the other cheek, pray for those that despitefully use you, return good for evil. Oh, no, you can't afford to do that. You need to get in there and slug it out, The wisdom of God is foolishness to the world. But the wisdom of the world is foolishness with God. You see, a lot of what would be construed as worldly wisdom. We're going to see where worldly wisdom comes from. A lot of what is construed as worldly wisdom, practical, how do you handle life, is in reality foolishness when you understand that the starting point, true wisdom, is the fear of the eternal. That's the starting point. We'll come to that in a few minutes. Let's go a little further. Let's come back to Colossians chapter 1. Now, God says that the wisdom of this world is foolishness to him. God, of course, is not against wisdom. Paul talks about that in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 9. He says, for this cause we also, since the day we heard it, don't cease to pray for you and to desire that you might be filled with the knowledge of His will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding. Not only does He want you to know what the will of God is, but He wants you to know that with wisdom and spiritual understanding, to have the spiritual ability and perception to know how to apply God's will. You see, that's what he says in verse 10, that you might walk worthy of the Lord unto all pleasing, being fruitful in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God, strengthened with all might according to His glorious power, unto all patience and long-suffering with joyfulness, giving thanks unto the Father, who has made us meet, has made us fit or qualified to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light, who has delivered us from the power of darkness and has translated us into the kingdom of His dear Son. No longer are we citizens of Satan's empire. No longer are we under the power, the control, are we the subjects of Satan the devil. We have thrown off that allegiance, that loyalty. We have died to sin when we were buried in baptism, and we've come up to walk in newness of life. God makes us, He makes us fit or suitable to share in the inheritance of the saints. He delivers us from the power of darkness and translates us into the kingdom of His dear Son. We are transferred, our citizenship. Paul talks about in Philippians, our citizenship is in heaven. We're not in heaven, but that's where our citizenship resides. We're citizens of the New Jerusalem. And the New Jerusalem is going to come down from God out of heaven to the earth. And that's where our citizenship is. That's where our loyalty and our allegiance is. We are citizens of the kingdom of God. We're strangers and sojourners in this earth. So, it's one of the reasons we don't participate in the various political affairs and things of that sort of this nation, because we are citizens of the kingdom of God. We have renounced our citizenship in Satan's world, and we're not a part of his system. We have redemption through the blood of Christ, verse 14, even the forgiveness of sins. Now, we find here that Paul talks about being filled with the knowledge of His will in all wisdom. You can go through and memorize vast portions of Scripture, but having the wisdom to understand how to apply it goes on beyond that. Let's go back a little further to the book of James. Let's understand a little more on this matter of true wisdom. James 1:1, or James 1:2, let's just pick it up in verse 2. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into different trials, different tests. Now, I don't know about you, but for most of us, the first thing that pops into your mind when you run into a test is not, oh, joy, I'm so excited and so happy I got a trial. Just can't wait to... Well, no, we don't generally like trials and tests, do we? Why does he say count it all joy? There's nothing enjoyable about going through it, but the results are where the joy comes in. Verse 3, knowing this, that the trying of your faith works patience. It works steadfast, enduring character. Character that is tried and tested. Let patience have her perfect work, that you may be complete and entire, wanting nothing. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men liberally and upbraids not, and it'll be given him. Now, let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. If you waver, you're like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed. If you lack wisdom, ask of God. When we face problems, the natural tendency is when we're going through trials and tests, the first thing that comes to our mind is, Lord, get me out of this. Now, God says what we need to think about is learning the lesson we can learn while we're in the middle of it, because then it will produce something in our lives. Now, probably most of the trials and tests we go through have come about because of some of our own choices and decisions. We bring a lot of our trials on ourselves. Not necessarily all of them. Sometimes the trials come about because of the decisions or choices of other people. But one thing about it, there's no trial that any of us are going through that God is unaware of. So, a trial or a test that is taking place in our lives involves the knowledge and the awareness of God. And we're given a promise here. If we don't understand what we're what the purpose of this is. If we can't understand the lesson, if you lack wisdom, ask of God. So the kind of wisdom that we're seeking to grow in is not worldly wisdom, the wisdom of this world, which is foolishness with God. But it is godly wisdom. The wisdom that you ask of God and receive. God is willing to and desirous to give it out. We have to come to Him in faith and confidence, knowing and believing that God is real. But we can come and ask God to give us wisdom, to give us that perception. Now notice back in James 3, verse 13. And let's understand more fully on this matter of wisdom. Who is a wise man and endued with knowledge among you? Let him show out of a good conduct his works with meekness of wisdom. If you have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, glory not and lie not against the truth. This wisdom descends not from above, but is earthly, sensual, and devilish. Where envying and strife is, there's confusion in every evil work. The wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, without hypocrisy. The fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. See, James goes right on in chapter 4, and he says, Now whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence even of your own lust that war in your members? You lust and have not, and kill and desire to have and cannot obtain. Well, James contrasts two totally different kinds of wisdom. There is the wisdom that is from above, and that's contrasted with the wisdom that does not descend from above, the wisdom that is from beneath. A wisdom that is characterized as earthly, sensual, and devilish. So there are three sources that this particular wisdom comes from. One is purely earthly. It is the basis of human society and human culture. It is the pressures of society, the influences of society, what seems like good ideas and practical ideas just from a societal standpoint. Earthly, it's also sensual, based on the senses, on the physical appetites, on the lusts of the flesh. People put in a great deal of ingenuity to try to figure out how to get what they want and not have to pay the penalty for it. And, there's a certain worldly wisdom trying to sneak around and have their cake and eat it too. Well, it's a wisdom that doesn't descend from above. It's earthly, it's sensual. And the third source of it is it's devilish. So it's generated by the society around, by our own appetites and lusts, or by Satan the devil, reflecting his attitude and his approach. These are the three sources that lead us into sin. Earthly, sensual, and devilish. It is a wisdom that does not descend from above. It produces envying and strife. And where envying and strife is, there's confusion in every evil work. There is a wisdom that is from above. And it is quite a difference. It's the wisdom that James referred to in James 1 when he said, If you lack wisdom, ask of God, who gives to all men liberally. The wisdom God gives is wisdom that is from above. And the first characteristic of it is pure. It's pure in heart, pure in motive. It's not involving trying to sort of put one over on somebody. Ever listen to some of these ads on the radio? They go along and they're advertising something and they're talking in sort of a normal speed. And then all of a sudden they get to the rest of the story, to the disclaimer. And the guy just, boom, he rattles it off so fast, there's no way in the world you can hear what he says. They must have a special school where they train these people as to how to rattle off this stuff so fast. Or you have some policy, an insurance policy, and then they have all the fine print. And they say, now you need to read all this. Well, read all of this. You'd probably go cross-eyed and blind if you tried, and when you get to the end of it, you can't make heads or tails of what they're saying. they don't intend for you to read it and to understand it, because you see, the wisdom that comes from beneath, the first and primary characteristic of it is not purity. It's filled with hidden motives. It's filled with a way that some guy has figured out how to separate you and your money. And he can sort of get in between the two. But Satan doesn't come along and put a disclaimer on his things. He appears as an angel of light. So Satan does not come up and say, you know, the wisdom I've got to offer is earthly, sensual, and devilish. Would you like some? That's not what he told Eve. You know, that was what he told Eve back in the garden. She looked at the fruit of the tree and she says, it's something to be desired to make one wise. She wanted wisdom. But she got her wisdom from the wrong source. You can get the wisdom from above or the wisdom from below. This world is based on the wisdom from below. The wisdom that is earthly, sensual, and devilish. Now, that's not a good source. What is it produced? Well, it's produced bitter envying and strife. We live in a world that is filled with pain, that is filled with heartache and suffering and warfare and every sort of problem. We live in a world that is faced with all sorts of conflict, even in families. Every sort of horrible thing. You know, this terrible, tragic situation up north this past week of the little 6-year-old boy killing a little classmate. You know, a horrible situation. You look at these things and realize how many times all the world over is pain and heartache and suffering, and it is a consequence of something. It is a consequence of the wisdom that descends not from above, the wisdom that is earthly, sensual, and devilish. That has produced our society. The problem is not intelligence, it's not education in the sense of technical education. The problem involves wisdom and character, a lack of the wisdom that comes from above. Now, what James brings out here is that there is a noted contrast. And the way you tell the difference is the results that are produced. The wisdom from above is first pure. The motives are clear and clean. Then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated. The world has a different approach. And the result of that, of course, is a lot of strife, a lot of contention, a lot of problems. Notice on over just a little bit, Peter talks about, you see, here, let's look at an example. We'll look here in 1 Peter chapter 3, and let's look at an example that involves godly wisdom as opposed to worldly wisdom. Because often godly wisdom flies directly in the face of worldly wisdom. People look at godly wisdom and they say, well, that's not practical. That won't work. Well, you see, the first thing they've done is they have left out the fact that there is a real God. So if God says, do this and I'll bless you, then you can count on that because that comes from God. The starting point for real wisdom is the fear and the reverence and the awe of God. The family, the state of the family in our Western world certainly reflects what worldly wisdom has produced. Oh, we've got experts. We've got psychiatrists and we've got psychologists and we've got, all sorts of government studies. They did one back a couple of years ago, funded it. I don't know how much taxpayer money was involved. There was a considerable amount. They'd made some grants and they finally came out with a result. Time magazine ran a cover article. Men and women, they really are different. Well, they had some experts study that. They had spent, several years and a lot of money, and they had finally come to the conclusion that men and women are really different. Now, I don't, you just sort of shake your head. But you see, you realize that a lot of the psychologists and psychiatrists have come out, and a lot of what passes in terms of modern culture and the attempt to turn things upside down and militant feminism and all of this is based on the premise that men and women aren't different, and if they are, then obviously God made a mistake and we need to rectify it. And so it is a false concept, worldly wisdom. Notice what Peter says here. Peter wouldn't be too popular in today's society. 1 Peter 3:1, he says, "Likewise, you wives, be in subjection to your own husbands." I'll tell you what, most places, you could, if people had their books open, they'd be shutting them in a hurry. That wouldn't be real popular. This is wisdom that comes from above. Wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they may also without the word be won by the conduct of the wives. So Peter isn't even talking primarily to, he's certainly not talking solely to wives of converted husbands. He's talking to wives who are married to husbands that do not obey the word. And he says, you don't have to preach to them. Live a life that will witness to them. They may be won by the conduct of the wives. Verse 2, while they behold your chaste conduct, coupled with fear, with reverence, with respect, whose adorning, let it not be the outward adorning. Rather, let it be the hidden man of the heart. And he makes a contrast. Our society places greatest value on what's put on the outside. And Peter's not condemning here the fact that a person could be neat and clean and appropriately groomed and appropriately dressed for the occasion. What he's talking about is a price. That's something God values. Now, the world doesn't value it. If you look around at the women who are the most highly paid, the most, quote, successful from a worldly standpoint, you look at somebody like Madonna, who's made millions, who certainly is not adorned with a meek and quiet spirit. Yet God says that in His sight is of great price. Verse 5, for after this manner in the old time, the holy women also, who trusted in God, adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, showing him respect, whose daughters you are, as long as you do well, and are not afraid with any amazement. Now that last phrase has puzzled a lot of people. The point that it's making is simply the fact that what often stands in the way of women doing what they need to do is their fear of the consequences. They're afraid it won't work. And so they feel the need to take things in their own hands and do something differently. You see, Sarah obeyed Abraham. That's the example that's given. You go back and read in the book of Genesis, and you find that Abraham wasn't the perfect husband. In fact, Abraham, on two particular occasions, pulled a stunt that you read and you sort of shake your head and say, I can't believe he did that. Well, maybe Sarah sort of thought that. But what did Sarah do? She trusted in God. She did not berate and attack her husband. She didn't call him names and do all sorts of things. She looked to God, and God took care of her. God delivered her. Sarah showed respect to her husband, whose daughters you are, as long as you do well. You see, she's singled out as an example. So the wisdom that comes from above talks about how to make a successful family. And so wives are instructed here in terms of showing proper respect and of not allowing their fear. Well, maybe this will happen and maybe that will happen. You see, fear can control us, or faith can control us. Faith can be what rules our life. Sarah she obeyed Abraham because she obeyed and respected God. Now notice verse 7. Likewise you husbands. Here's again wisdom that comes from above. Likewise you husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, the one who's more fragile, more sensitive. That's what the word means. Doesn't mean that she has less intelligence. It isn't even really primarily referring to physical strength, though women do normally not have the upper body strength and the physical endurance that a man has. But the expression here primarily is referring to being more fragile, more easily broken, more sensitive, as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. So Peter explains the wisdom that comes from above to women, and he points them toward the things that God values and toward the example of Sarah. And then he says, now likewise you husbands, you also need to think about these things. Dwell with them according to knowledge. Seek to understand that women are different than men. And not just in the outward physical appearance, but they are different even in terms of the way their minds and emotions work. Dwell with them according to knowledge. Give honor. Recognize she's more fragile. She's more sensitive, more easily hurt. And be aware of that. You're heirs together of the grace of life. Woman is not some inferior species. Rather, we're heirs together of the grace of life. And Peter explains, if you don't do that, your prayers are hindered. You're not going to be close to God. God's not really going to be listening. You're not going to be getting through if you're not showing that kind of love that Christ showed for the church. So he says, goes on, verse 8, he says, finally, be all of one mind, having compassion one of another, love as brethren, be filled with pity, be courteous, not rendering evil for evil or railing for railing, but counterwise blessing, knowing that hereunto are you called, that you should inherit a blessing. He that will love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips that they speak no guile. Let him eschew evil and do good and seek peace and ensue it. Because God's eyes are over the righteous and His ears are open to their prayers. Now, Peter is explaining here the wisdom that comes from above. This wisdom, this approach to life, this approach to family life is not earthly, sensual, and devilish. And it is not the accepted wisdom of our world, of our society. But God says the wisdom of this world is foolishness to God. It's absolutely foolish. Oh, God gives us many places and much instruction on the whole concept of wisdom. Godly wisdom, the wisdom that comes from above, that is pure in its motivation, that is peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated. We're told a very key verse. I've referred to it earlier, but it's a key verse in terms of wisdom, is Proverbs 9:10. The fear of the eternal is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding. Standing in awe and reverence of God is the real beginning of true wisdom. The wisdom that comes from above. It is based on standing in deep awe and reverence of God. The book of Proverbs tells us that part of the purpose here, he talks about wisdom, and Proverbs 2:2, he says, incline your ear unto wisdom. And he says the result of that, if wisdom enters into your heart, verse 10, it will deliver you, verse 12, from the way of the evil man. Verse 16, it'll deliver you from the strange woman. It'll keep you from the wrong kinds of people. The people who are going to get you in trouble. The kind of men and women that will lead you astray. Goes on in verse 5, chapter 3, verse 5. He says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not unto your own understanding. Now we saw earlier that the way of a fool is right in his own eyes. Well, a very important part of wisdom is trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not unto your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. Don't be a know-it-all. Now, let's look a little bit here at verse 5 and 6. Verse 6 says, in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths. In all your ways. That is a key, a key point, because so often we don't commit all of our ways unto God. In all your ways acknowledge Him. He will direct your paths. A lot of problems, a lot of things come because we don't fully turn it over and commit it to God. And I think we have to sort of lean to our own understanding. I think that maybe something isn't important enough for God, or God wouldn't be concerned. But rather, in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your path. Be prepared to turn our life and our will over to God, to acknowledge Him in every aspect of our life. Whatever it is we're facing, whatever difficulty, whatever things that we're looking at having to go through, acknowledge Him. Go to God about it, and He will direct your paths. We can all sometimes go through some unnecessary problems and difficulties because we did not acknowledge Him in all of our ways. Well, the Scripture goes on to tell us here in Proverbs 3:11, my son, despise not the chastening of the Lord. You see, God is working with us, and this ties in with back in James 1. Don't despise the chastening of the Lord. Whom the Lord loves, He corrects. When we fall, when we're tested, then we realize that this test is to lead us somewhere. And if we lack wisdom, ask of God, and He will give it. Verse 13 says, happy is the man that finds wisdom. It's better than silver, better than gold, more precious than rubies. Verse 15. Chapter 4, verse 7, wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore, get wisdom. The wisdom is intended to guide us in an approach to life. The fear of God is the starting point. It is the beginning of wisdom. Now, true wisdom comes down to the way we live our lives. It tells us in Proverbs 14:1, every wise woman builds her house, but the foolish plucks it down with her hands. Chapter 11, verse 29, tells us pretty much the same thing, only it's written from a man's perspective. He that troubles his own house shall inherit the wind. The fools shall be servant to the wise of heart. Now, someone is very foolish if they trouble their own house. A wise woman, and obviously a wise man, are seeking to build up their house. But the foolish plucks it down. A man who troubles his own house is going to inherit the wind. You look at someone and he may pursue all sorts of money, and he pursues this endeavor and that endeavor. But if he's troubling his own house, if he's doing things that are tearing down his family, that are hurting his wife and his children, ultimately he's going to inherit a handful of wind. Now, you try to get your hand around the wind and you find you don't have much. A handful of wind is nothing. It's something that is empty. It is the ultimate of futility. See, wisdom, true wisdom, leads in the pathways of God. A woman who's wise will build up her house. She's going to be doing the things that are going to be constructive and good, showing love and respect to her husband and proper love for her children and teaching them. A wise woman builds up her house. Her focus is properly directed. A foolish woman plucks it down with her hands. She makes decisions and choices by her words and by her actions that is destroying everything that is good and that is important. So the emphasis over and over, and we could go through many aspects of this, but the point is that we live in a world that is devoid of the wisdom that comes from above. The wisdom of this world is foolishness to God, because the wisdom of this world is based on what is earthly, sensual, and devilish. It's based on the ways that seem right unto a man. It's based on human wisdom. It's based on people who lean to their own understanding, who put their trust in their own heart. Based on the ideas of people to whom God is not real, and to whom sin is sort of a joke. And what is produced is earthly, sensual, and devilish. What is produced is the attitude and the mindset and the approach to life that has resulted in all of the strife and the envy that permeates our world. It has resulted in the pain and the heartaches and the headaches. It has resulted in the problems in families and the problems between nations. It has resulted in the world that you and I inhabit. A world that is the product of worldly wisdom. Wisdom from below. What God offers is the wisdom from above. Wisdom that is pure and peaceable, that is easy to be entreated. Wisdom that is based on the ways of God. The natural man, the natural mind looks at the wisdom of God and he says, that's foolishness, that won't work. You can't be kind to people. You can't do this and do that. You can't do these things and live that way of life. That won't be practical. You see, the things of God are foolishness to the natural man. It doesn't make sense to them that you could give something away and yet be blessed and have more as a result. Oh no, that's foolishness too. It doesn't make sense, but it makes sense to God, because the wisdom that comes from above is based on the realization that God is real and God's ways are real. It's based on the fact that the fear of God, the awe and the reverence and the deep, profound respect for God is the starting point for the wisdom that descends from above. This world is in desperate need of the wisdom that descends from above. The reasons that the world is in the state that it's in is because it lacks true, godly wisdom. It's reflected in our homes, and it's reflected in our communities, and it's reflected in our nations and in our world. The time is coming when the God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom. And the knowledge of God's ways are going to go out until the knowledge of God covers the earth like the waters cover the sea. And true godly wisdom, the wisdom that descends from above, is going to guide this world, its homes and families and communities. You and I have the opportunity today to choose between the wisdom that we will seek in our lives. The wisdom that comes from below, that's earthly, sensual, and devilish, or the wisdom that comes from above, the wisdom that comes from God, the wisdom that offers to us the help and the guidance that will be good for today and tomorrow and forever.